Hello everybody, welcome back to The Soulful Soul. My name is Gladys. In today's video, I'm speaking to my friend and comrade Frank Mankies. Frank was part of a two-part series that I did a while back, maybe 2 months ago, where we spoke about the transition, South Africa's transition to a new democracy in 1994. One of the issues Frank spoke about was the decision by the South African government to move away from the Reconstruction and Development Programme, which is focused very much on redress and equity, to a more growth-orientated strategy in the form of GEAR, which is the Growth, Employment and Redistribution strategy. And what we hone in on in this discussion is why did government feel the need to do that? And then what were the ramifications of it? What was the impact, particularly on the poorest, And so we explore that, and then we move into a couple of other things that are related to that and the economy and education. And it's just a discussion between friends, but I guess the thing about Frank is what he brings to the table is an ability to take complex issues and simplify them for lay people. Like when it comes to the economy, that's not my forte. And he simplifies things in practical terms and in terms of, in ways that we can relate them to day-to-day issues and to what we see around us. I'm really thankful to be able to call on people like Frank to share their expertise, their opinions, their insights. So enjoy, friends, and yeah, I'll chat with you soon. Welcome back, Frank. Let me get to the questions. I've got four big questions, right? Shall I go through them quickly as a reminder, and then I'll ask them as we go through. So the first one is going back to our discussion, just honing in on when you were talking about those first years, and and when we ditched basically the RDP and opted for a neoliberal approach. So my question around that is then, what did that mean in practice, and why did we do that, and then what do you think the result was that was directly related? Then the second one is, what was the alternative? I mean, we could have carried on our route. Were there other alternatives, and what do you envisage the result would have been? Where would we be now with this crisis? Would we have been in a better position from your perspective? And then coming to the now we have this crisis, and it's surfaced all the inequalities, it's surfaced what's not working really. And what do you think are the biggest issues for our country? What is the outlook? And then I wanted to add this one about, which is quite topical, is the loans from the IMF, because there's quite a lot about that. I listened to Duma Kubule, as you suggested, and I also listened to a video with Neil, an interview with Neil Coleman, and well, Duma was saying something about, why are we taking a loan from the IMF when we have these 100 million reserves in the UIF and the foreign exchange, right, reserves. But Neil wasn't saying something like, what I heard him say was, the concern is not so much the loan as much as the lack of transparency about how the loan's going to be used. So those are the things that I wanted to look at, and maybe we'll even diverge into specific issues as we go along. So when we were chatting in our previous discussion, you spoke about the RDP and what that did for the country those first 3 to 5 years, and how much service delivery that enabled us to do. And then we opted for a neoliberal approach in the form of GEAR, right? So the question for me, what that raises is why? What did it mean in practice? Why did we opt for that? Something was working, and then we went a different way. And then what do you think the effect of that was?
I think the analysis by the political leadership at that time within the ANC was actually that they were not happy with the path that we had been taking, and they wanted higher levels of growth. And they imagined that the higher levels of growth would come from taking a path that meant turning away from more social spending, and that would include lower taxes. So that kind of thing was a seduction. It's filled with a lot of promises, but in fact it never yielded those results that they talked about. So what you do have in those times is that you have these advisors. We have these advisors who actually promise you that your country will be high-flying, a big economic success with these high growth rates. But that isn't the case. The investors didn't come as promised. You did, in the end, reduce the taxes to the big corporates. And then through reducing the taxes, you also, I guess, turn your back on the kind of scale of delivery and redress that we needed. So it took us, I guess, down a path that was worse for the country than ever before. In fact, from then on, we had a slight rise in growth rates because of world conditions. But subsequently, we could see that we did not create anywhere near the kinds of jobs we wanted. In fact, even in that period under Gia, we had a net job losses. So in some areas of the economy, there were these jobs increases, but in others, there were the retrenchments. And so we had this continuing decline in certain manufacturing sectors. So why did we take that path? It's, well, when you believe the orthodoxy, when you're a new government coming into power, you often are not given a lot of options. You are told these are the parameters. And if you follow these parameters, we will accept you within, I guess, an orthodox world community. And once you're accepted, you could become one of those countries that are the darling of investors. And I think that was the seduction that attracted us.
Right. Okay. And then, so if we had continued down the alternative route, continued the route we were going, or an alternative, Frank, what do you think the result would have been? Where would we be sitting now?
So when you come to power, you have to realize that the power is in your hands, and you have to exercise that power. If you come to power feeling you've only got political power, that you don't really have the economic power, you'll see your options as very constrained. And Winnie Mandela kept making this statement. She said that we are in power politically, but economically, we are not in power. And she held that critique, I think, to the end of her days. And then if you want to take a different path, you would firstly pursue a line of promoting economic activities which are job-rich, which encourage the largest number of people to be employed. And I think even if you look at it today, you can see the huge opportunities for that. That in fact, if you lead investment in areas like housing delivery, you can get large numbers of people employed. If, for example, you approach food security differently, there are ways in which more and more people can get engaged and drawn into the economy. And then through the way in which they work their land and their farms on the small scale, and ensure that those food products find their way to supermarkets and other markets, many more people will have a kind of a resilience in terms of food security. You can see that now in terms of the kind of climate change and the needs that exist for creating, so I guess, new kinds, the new technologies, the new kind of facilities that we need in order not to rely so much on the electricity that comes from the coal service. So, for example, the production of solar panels. So there are numerous things in that arena that are imported. So we can have a whole industry there which revolves around the possibility of solar and using wind as well. So that's the way you would go. You would also build economies from the local level upwards. You won't sit back and wait for investors. You would also use a great deal of local economic development, working in cities and in towns, and in different ways have a local economic development plan, which would then look at what are some of the needs and demands in the local area and how those can be met in that local area, rather than using, I guess, transport systems which are very bad for the environment to cart things long distances, as well as from outside of the country. So a local economic development would be part of such a plan. And I think the key thing would be to focus a lot more on distribution. You remember earlier on we talked about the importance of the basic income grant.
Yes.
The importance of, in fact, ensuring that there are effective taxation systems so that people have the basic resources to be able to be productive in society. So through inputs on that side, people become more creative. And then I think the small business development is that through those inputs, people then become empowered to become much more entrepreneurial at the lower levels through collective means as individuals and households. And all those possibilities would actually be strengthened rather than reduced. What is very interesting about the capitalist system is that it gobbles up its own. So often they lock out the smaller businesses. They don't create space for them. And the monopolies begin to devour more and more of the resources. And you find that you end up with a society in which your small business sector is very, very weak, it's very precarious. And we are exactly in that position.
Okay. And you know, Frank, the basic income grant, in fact, in the next question, which is about here we are in COVID, which I believe is a good thing in a way, in that it's surfaced, it has surfaced all the inequalities that have been obvious to some of us, but not to everyone. But it's definitely doing that. And but I want to talk a bit about the basic income grant. But what do you think are the biggest issues for us as a country, and what is the outlook? And this notion of the basic income grant, and I suppose the question of the response of government. People have been talking about we need a humanitarian response. Is big a part of that, and how has government fared in that regard?
Yeah, so I think the first part, the humanitarian part, government has attempted to respond, and it's talked about this 500 billion that it's made available.
Yeah.
But much of that has not been for households and for communities. Lately, I've seen a statistic where government is saying that about 5 million people did get the 350 Rand grant. And 7 million people applied, but they're saying that that's the statistic. Of course, in the popular imagination and understanding, it is that very few people have received that. We need, I guess, more evidence and more independent research into that. That humanitarian response was also extremely delayed, so it came very late. the funds that were going to businesses reach them much, much quicker. So there's something to be said about that response.
Yeah.
I think the third thing to say about the response is that the mechanisms for the response in many areas has been very bad, very poor, very ineffective, and we shouldn't be surprised. So if you have a poor public service before the COVID, why would you have a more effective public service after? It's not logical.
Yes, yes, yes.
Also, we should have had the ideal for distributing things like food parcels and actually cooked food to people is the use of local government and its mechanisms. But as we know, our local governments are in a very weak state. They're not effective. They're poorly administered. And many of them have been struggling. The vast majority of them have not had the capacities nor the resources, in fact, to meet the needs of the people. And then they also haven't had the will to meet the needs of people. So come this crisis, you'll find that these things then are, in some cases, bypass the local governments and then being distributed through some other channels. And as we see that so many of those channels have actually hijacked the distribution of those resources. Yeah. We've seen corruption, we've seen diversion of those resources. And in any case, the totality of those, of that relief is just so little, far too little. I know of entire provinces where I get reports that they haven't seen food parcels. They haven't seen soup kitchens from governments, or, for example, a province like Limpopo. So that response has been very, very weak. And then I think generally coming to this issue of the basic income grant, that relates to, I think, the broader understanding of our society and how divided it is. You have a huge middle class, which, given the way capitalism works, it actually aggregates, it actually draws up most of the resources upwards to a tiny few. So many in the middle class, you know, they are the ones in society who are better off. But many of them actually are, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 salaries away from being in the same situation as the poor. They have these bonds to pay. They have all these costs and expenses. And particularly if you talk of the black middle class, many of them, it's much more in their head, and it's a much more a sense of interim comforts that they have, but it's very precarious. And then you then have this large mass of people. And the last time I gave you the figure that 20 million people, half of South Africans, are poor, and then half of that half are ultra poor. So in that situation, you really got a society which, in a way, is really held together by the grace of God, if I can use such a term. It is very close to conflict and to explosions. It actually represents tender, dry conditions for conflagration. And so we have now come to the COVID, and it's exposed that again to all those people who didn't know. 2 people, for example, among the white middle class. It's made people behind their high walls again aware of how divided and how unequal South Africa is. And again, it's made some of the leadership within the new elite, the people who actually have come along the wave of liberation to take over the reins of government, aware again of how serious the problem is. They would have already admitted to you there's a problem, but it's the depth and the scale of poverty and inequality. So the basic income grant is something that we've been lobbying for because it harks back to what we've been saying about a different path. One which says that actually, if you focus a lot more on creating demand in an economic sense by the kinds of activities you have at grassroots level and the kinds of transfers and inputs you make at grassroots level. You will be stimulating this economy and growing it much better.
Yeah.
So those inputs that will come from a basic income grant will actually increase demand in the economy and would actually be good, I guess, for the entire economic system, make it much more vibrant, and I guess will actually help the supply side of the economy. So the basic income grant is a much longer term thing, and it preceded COVID. It's not about relief. It's saying that in a way, in order to have a society that functions well, you need the mass of people to have a share in the resources so that they can participate in the economy. And they'll participate in a number of ways using that grant. So if you take the kind of burden that is on women, you know, that falls on women within the households and all those kinds of activities. So the grant would help with child care, with nutrition for children. And then again, I guess would help with our human resource problem and challenge in the country through that. Secondly, it will help with the possibilities around entrepreneurial activity. People in local communities can start pooling their money together. They can start thinking beyond survival, how to do very small-scale survivalist economic activities, drawing on those resources. If several people in a house is getting that basic income grant, and assuming that grant was something like 500 Rand, a number of people can get together and say, we will all go to the market and buy these and these kinds of items, and then we will repackage them and sell them in that way. So it would start people on a part of entrepreneurialism. And then I think the third thing is that people having that money in their pockets as disposable income is at the other side of that whole equation of supply and demand, is people being able to turn their needs into demand, and that demand then helps the overall economy. It's a no-brainer actually in a society like ours.
Yes. I think this is a big issue at the moment, is the loan from the IMF, the loans that we are taking. And so you suggested I listen to Duma Kubule, and he was talking about the fact that we have reserves of over 100 million in foreign exchange reserves and in the UIF. So why are we taking these loans? And so there's that, what he said, and then there's also other people speaking about not so much that the loans are a problem, because I know that in the past, the IMF and World Bank loans were very tied to conditions for countries, right? But these are not, these are lighter. Am I right? Oh, that's what I understand.
That's true.
Yeah. But so there's the other view that is saying it's not so much the loans that are a problem as it is the lack of transparency around those loans. So what is your take on that?
So I think a couple of things. Yeah, the first is, you know, if you take Duma Kubule's view that in fact South Africa does have a lot of pots or pools of resources where government can borrow from. That is correct. You know, the UIF has huge amounts of monies. The pension funds of collectively, different kinds of pension funds as well, huge amounts of resources there. And he's explained that those resources are not jeopardized by making loans from those resources to government at all. And in the same way that government has to pay back overseas lenders, it would pay back to these pension funds. So there is that possibility and those options, and that is why, in fact, South Africa has not in the past taken loans from the IMF.
Yes.
So we should really consider those. I think the second thing to say is that it is important that the government does actually take loans now, so that it takes an expansionist view, a view that's beyond the crisis and looking to the future, and that allows us to inject resources in a similar way that I was speaking about earlier, that in fact government could find different ways of stimulating economic development in the country. And so, for example, now, if you think about the kinds of resources we said should be made available under the basic income grant for everyone. If you think of the kind of resources that we are saying are needed actually to bail out small businesses, particularly some of them in the hospitality sector, you can see that that in fact there are constraints that the government faces. We also have to take into account that, I guess, given the last couple of months and the inactivity and standstill in large parts of the private sector, that taxation that we'll take in for now will be a lot lower.
Yes.
So we think that a government that takes a view of non-austerity in a situation like ours is positive, because it then allows resources to flow down to the grassroots, so that in fact the capacities at the grassroots level in communities and households is increased to participate. It is a good thing. Now, coming to the IMF, the thing about this body is that in the past, throughout Africa, in the last year since the 60s, there are stringent conditions that they've applied as meant structural adjustment. They've actually called on the governments they loan to not to make the kinds of allocations they were making to social services, to make cuts in education, to make cuts in things like healthcare, to make cuts in salaries of public sector workers. So in that case, they've actually brought much more inequality, greater pressure, and greater, I suppose, economic ruin to some of those countries in the past. But in this case, they are not using that particular, they're just using a rapid response measure. And so there aren't that many conditions. All they are requiring is that the money is spent in a way that's transparent, and that they will themselves be wanting clear reports about how the money is spent. So it is true that it is much lighter, and the interest rates are very low as well. The interest rates are 1%. So it is a loan that is a lot better, and I agree here with Neil Corbin. The bigger problem and the bigger issue is that in the South African context, the way the elites have organized themselves has been that once they hear that there's a big announcement, they literally rub their hands with glee. They line up around the tender system. And in an emergency situation, the tender system has to bypass some of the normal steps and processes, because it has to be a rapid response. And in that way, you then find companies come in which do not have a track record, which have a crony relationship with the people in power, and then worst of all, which actually have price escalations that are way out of market-related prices, and which sees huge amounts of money, millions wasted. And the Minister of Finance said recently that, in fact, it isn't true that most of this money is being plundered. Most of the relief money, the 500 billion, much of it is being used to deliver to people. He, in fact, goes on to say that the vast majority is. So he would say that and he may or may not be right.
Yes,
The
yes.
problem is that he's talking to South Africans who have the experience of what happened during the Zuma years.
Yes.
They have the information
Yes.
coming out
Yes.
of the Zondo Commission.
Yes.
Multiplied billions were stolen at that time.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you look at now the kinds of information that's coming out of Gauteng province, it is true that people then who have, I guess, links, really those kinds of associations with political leaders, nepotistic connections, have in fact, been lining up, been bypassing, and have been accessing these resources in a way that raises eyebrows. We have seen various instances of theft of monies that were meant to go for this particular personal equipment for the health services. We've seen money that was meant to go towards food parcels also going astray. We've seen UIF money also being intercepted by corrupt hands. So this problem is real. And so I think Neil and Kosatu and Saftu are correct when they say that the use of these funds has to be carefully monitored. Yes. We will be paying back this money over a period of time. Yeah. And it could be at a cost to ourselves if the exchange rate shifts in the wrong direction. We will be paying back for monies that were not used for the purpose that they were meant for. And this is often a problem in post-colonial states where resources then are not used in the right way. Those who have come into power came there with a particular visions, but at a certain point become exasperated or for whatever other reason give up those visions. And then in the end, the resources that are used in this way, that are raised through taxes or that are borrowed, are actually squandered. At the same time, we find the poor getting poorer, the gap between rich and poor increasing, widening, or remaining stubbornly present. And so these are the challenges we face in the country. I think lastly, I would like to just point to the kind of scenario that we are in at the moment. So there's this one scenario which is about the resources that are borrowed or that are raised through taxes being plundered on a big scale. On the other hand, we have the heights of the corporate world, where in fact you have the continuing of those behaviors that I would see as closely associated with the worst forms of capitalism, which is that you profiteer during a crisis. You have a monopoly on the health systems. You in areas where in fact you ought to be releasing a lot more resources for stimulating the economy, like making data available to the mass of South Africans. You actually continue to prioritize maximum profits for shareholders. And then you have the corruption on the side of the private sector, like you have the instances of the Steinhoff, where in fact for years these are companies which are actually on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, but they are, in the way they are maneuvering and utilizing money, are also involved in malfeasance. So between those two worlds, we as South Africans are really in the dwang. And it's what is the prospects for us going forward. And the prospects for us is to transform that economic system, to actually ensure that these few companies which are at the heights of the economy, that those practices are actually transformed and not allowed and forced actually to be more in alignment with our vision of the kind of economy we want for South Africa. And we also have to move forward for, I guess, different leadership and more accountable systems of government.
And Frank, this notion of a watchdog, which is what Neil was talking about, and we can have watchdogs with other agendas, and then there's organizations like Corruption Watch that exist, I suppose. What are the chances of a watchdog, a proper watchdog? What are the discussions that are taking place around a watchdog that actually monitors how money is spent, particularly now?
Yes, I'll say two things now that probably will contradict myself. So I think that whenever you have a huge initiative that has attached to it millions of rands, billions of rands, government ought to set up an entity that would should be monitoring the use of those funds. And such an entity should be made up of various voices or people or representatives from the private sector. It should involve voices and entities from within government. And then it should involve stakeholders from within civil society, and they should be functioning at a very, very high level, and they should have beneath them people with some capabilities of tracking and following money and resources. Now I will contradict myself, and I would say how surprised I was when the president said the other day he's setting up special initiatives to follow up on the abuse of the state resources during this COVID intervention. And the reason I was surprised is that that is one of your responsibilities as a government.
Yes.
When you're in government and you come to power, you have about 3 or 4, according to the theory, 3 or 4 main roles and functions. You know, the security of the people, dealing with the needs of the most vulnerable, ensuring that there is a system, I guess, of law and order, that and ensuring, of course, that people comply with that system. So within your functions, a key role of a number of your departments is to ensure that, in fact, crime does not occur, and to be aware of it and respond to it. And especially if it occurs on a big scale, it ought to have been your job. You ought to have been aware of it and taking steps on that in the normal course of events.
Yes.
So that's the way I see it. And I think, given that, under normal circumstances, you ought to have that. But given that there is that failure in governance, I would then suggest that in instances where you have a huge initiatives, like at the time of the arms deal, they were getting in huge amounts of money was at stake. Huge amounts of resources were being allocated to purchase these arms. Something like that should have been in place. Similarly now with this allocation of the 500 billion and it being spent in a very rapid way. And there are many other instances where there's a huge infrastructure program announced with billions attached to it to target a particular objective. We should have such a structure in place. At the moment, at the NGO level, we do have bodies like Corruption Watch, and those bodies are there. We also have the bodies that are located within the media with certain investigative responsibilities.
Yes.
And so some of those bodies are also very useful in the margins. Those bodies are good because they can raise the flag, they can sound the alarm. But what we need is who can follow through with getting all the information and the evidence and the prosecution. And so we need something at a much higher level.
Okay. Thanks, Frank. Well, I've got you here. Firstly, I just want to share something, and then I want to ask a question around education, because I think it's almost like we have a tendency to it's so critical, and yet it becomes pushed to the side in a way, even though not really, but in a way it does. In practice, it does. But
yes, it does.
I want to share with you. So as part of this, looking at the mini towers that have come up through COVID-19, and by the tower I'm talking about, I don't have it here. The tower in the tarot.
Yes, yes.
Yes, so I've done 3 videos on the tower. And the most interesting thing, and they didn't work because they became political and, well, that wasn't a problem, but I was trying to do too many things with them. But I'll tell you this, and I think I mentioned it to you. All 3 takes, and these were like 2 weeks apart from each other. In the first question, when I asked the question, I put out the question, why? What is the lesson in COVID-19? Why these towers? Why this big tower for us? I got the Queen of Coins, right? Now, the Queen of Coins for me, and every time I got the Queen of Coins with other cards, right? And for me, the message, it was over and over. The need to recalibrate. It's like we have a chance to reset. So even spiritually, I think we're being pointed in that direction. We have such an opportunity, really, to reset because people have become more aware. We can't carry on looking at stuff and not responding. Today, I think I'm feeling so blue today because on the way to dropping Luke, I just heard on the news 3 children die in a house, burnt to death, right? And like, those can't be, I know if my child, that's not likely to happen in my house. And so there's some condition that allows it to happen for that person, you know? So this, the Queen of Coins, like, I'm probably going to edit this out, but I think it's an important point. The Queen of Coins in the tarot, and my reading of the Queen of Coins, is this person that is sitting comfortably, has all the resources they need, but they also share. It's a feeling of abundance, but it's an abundance for all, because the Queen of Coins to me represents also the Earth Mother, you know? It's like this abundance, this creativity. And I think that's, for the Queen of Coins to come up in every one of my readings is so powerful. And I think the message is clear even in that we have a chance to reset. The whole world has a chance to reset, but particularly South Africa, you know?
I agree. So the thing about the way our society is organized is that it's something that's handed down to us. And the mistake we make is to think that it's unchangeable.
Yes.
So it's something, the model is received, and it's an ideology. So because people don't think that it's an ideology, because your individual experiences are fragmented ones. So most people are frustrated with capitalism, but they will never put it that way because they're frustrated with this instance of something happening to them, and that instance, and they don't put them together as one system. So you're a Discovery Health payer, you're paying monthly, and then you realize, well, actually, I now have this serious thing happening to me, and somebody behind the desk there says, well, this thing is not allowed or permitted. Or they say, actually, you've used up your benefits for the year, you have to top up. So incredibly frustrated. Then they would go to whatever discount, and they find the price they paid for a medicine a month ago has doubled. And I have had that happen to me, which is some vitamin D things that my doctor said I should have, you know, was 12 Rand, and then it was 25 Rand. So now you're frustrated about all of these things, and then at the same time you're experiencing the work at something around a job loss. And then you'll go to your school and you'll find that the school is saying, actually, we're increasing the fees for your child for next year for X amount, and you've got no choice. So you don't put it together. So that's the system. Now, this is an inherited system. It's a system that's very different from an ideology of Ubuntu, a system which says, in fact, we do have enough in the world and we can share it, which is what you've just been talking about. And that system would say, you know, that obviously somewhere we'll have some incentives in this, but largely will be guided by the principle from each according to their ability and to each according to their needs.
Yeah.
So that would largely be guiding that within the whole principle of reciprocity that I spoke to you about before, so that everyone then would be involved in a reciprocal system. So what we do in societies, we don't want to think about an alternative because we think the received system is immutable, is unchangeable. And we also don't realize that it's a system that we're under. And that happened to us at the level of a country when we became free and we didn't make other choices. So let's just go to two other levels. So at the national level now where we are, forget about these companies and the corporate practices. We've got three crises. The one crisis is the economic crisis, millions excluded. The second is the ecological crisis, where we really can't continue in the way we are using, squandering, and abusing the resources. And then we have the democratic crisis. And the democratic crisis is the crisis that says that as citizens, we are so far removed from the people who are taking the decisions, both in the economic world and in the political world, and we need a citizen-led society. Of course, underneath all of that, you have the issues like this serious issues of inequality. You have these issues of race and patriarchy. It's wrapped up in that. But those are those three. And then at the personal level, you must bring this back. We must bring this back to the personal level. So at the personal level, if you take us all as South Africans, and you imagine us, or you take ourselves back to the point where the president announces the lockdown, the COVID, and if you are an individual sitting in Sandton, you could well be black or you could be white, and you are earning like $1 million a month. Can you think to yourself that, listen, in your lifetime, if you keep earning that way, you could never use that up? And why are you having abundance? And how are you using that abundance? And how, in not being able to use the abundance in a way to share, how you're bringing that curse upon yourself, and how, in fact, unless you change your behavior and your conduct in society yourself, you are actually a part of the problem in your behavior. What are the ways to adjust your mindset and your conduct? And then that would obviously shift into, if it happens on scale enough, into our visions and society changing more generally. The middle class now is a key for us. So this will be the last thing I'll say. The middle class is a key for us because it's interesting that the middle class, if you have a family in the Bluff or in Boksburg or somewhere, you are much better off. But in fact, your own existence as well is also subject to the shocks from the economic system. But your big problem is that in terms of your ideology, you think you are much better than everyone else, and you've got this belief in the capitalist system. So you think that maybe one day, next year or the following year, you could be like the very rich. And so you have this loyalty and bondage to the capitalist system. If we as the middle class could break that loyalty and that bondage to the capitalist system and have that vision for the poor, we could be joining up with the poor and the marginalized to create, I guess, that mass space, that mobilization, that strong voice, that united voice demanding a different society. So many of our problems are at the level of the way in which we've been co-opted at the ideological level. And then we would get a society that would be better for all. And then for the middle class, do you realize that in a society we're talking about, in the middle classes, your material conditions may not be much better than now, than you have as you have them at the moment. However, you could be working fewer days in the week, less hours for the same.
Yes.
And do you know that you could be having a much better social safety net, so that if ever you fall, it's never precarious.
Yes.
That safety net would be under you to carry you. Your life would be less stressed.
Yes.
You would be able to breathe a lot more, enjoy the air a lot more, enjoy the flowers and nature a lot more.
Yeah.
You wouldn't keep running for all these hours in the day until you're about 60. And then finding that when you cash in that pension system from that same capitalist system, realizing how little it is.
Yes.
Doing this, I suppose, this excessive frantic running and striving, hoping that you would have this huge amount of wealth at the end. And in the end, you don't have it, I think, as we all know. So what we're offering is that quality of life to the middle class, which says, you will have the same comforts, but fundamentally, you'll be in a society in which you won't have high walls. The poor will be with you, and you will be in a state of unity with it, and you'll have a bigger quality of life. And that is the vision of a society that's informed by Ubuntu.
Yes, yes. And then we're not worrying about healthcare. We're not worrying about education. You know, and I guess that's the one that's very painful for me at the moment, is the education one, you know, or I guess everything is an issue. The housing is an issue. The fact that some of us are safe and others are not in their homes, you know, and then with the education.
And this is, you're getting to a key thing of the capitalist system is the psychological effect it has on us.
Yeah.
So we are all in a state of ill health or dis-ease because of the worry. This thing of what capitalist system almost inserts into our bodies and system, that constant worry, like you were saying, that education system. I'm permitted to send my child there, but can I pay? Will I be able to pay? If the lockdown continues, will I be able to keep my child there? That endless worry. And it shouldn't be like that.
Yeah. But, you know, for me, Frank, I mean, it comes back to that middle class, working class thing, and black and white, I guess. But even some of us as Black people, our kids, like I know, well, I'm fortunate because I work from home. I know I can keep my child at home. My child goes to a good school. It's not a private school. And it's not as expensive as the private schools, but I know that he has the option of online learning, you know, and most South African children don't. And I think for me, the education thing is so much about the fact that that gap, that divide we started with a huge divide. We continued with that huge divide. We didn't know how to bridge it, or we didn't bridge it for a lack of will or for a lack of ability or whatever. We have fucked up the education system even more. I mean, maybe that's unfair, but that divide continues, and now it's exacerbated by COVID. So what happens? What happens to children from working class Black communities who don't have parents at home, don't have data, don't have the option of online? That's, you know, that is my question. And I guess it's important, I guess, Frank, because of what you're saying, is that it's somehow we have been taught this Western dog eat dog world. I only succeed if I'm trampling on you kind of world, which is the capitalist system. But we have to be thinking, like, my child can go, whether it's me or my neighbor, surely they can see that their domestic worker's child is not getting the benefits that their child gets. Likewise, my child can work from home and still be educated.
The question about thinking differently about this and understanding about it, it's that question of whether we can go to a higher level of consciousness compared to these received models that we have.
Yes.
And that higher level of consciousness starts to realize that I like your example, and I like you coming back to education, that if my children are going to a good school and someone else's children out there are going to the kind of schools that you see in many parts of the Eastern Cape, the kind of consequences you have at the level of I guess the vibrations, the unspoken,
Yes.
Means that then you are in a society that is actually broken, that's unbalanced. And this is why we get back then to the society which has a lot of violence in it and a lot of insecurity.
Yes.
So in the end, you think you're unconnected to the fortunes of someone else, but actually you are connected.
Yes.
And it comes back to you in ways that in a way are not always just apparent, I guess, you know, to just your normal way of looking at things. But you're in a society which is unbalanced, which is broken, which is in a way not functioning very well. And then you then go to the statistics that you would look at about whether it's you're talking about the farm killings, or whether you talk about gender-based violence, or whether you talk about the propensity of South Africans, I guess, to at a certain point wake up and attack people from other countries violently. You then also begin to look at I guess the ways in which we are sometimes in cities and in provinces where for no, just coming, I suppose, out of the natural world, you have a flood or you have fires, and you just find scores of people being killed. And these things then make us live in a society in South Africa where we are the most stressed. We have high levels of anxiety. If you are in an unequal society, there is nobody at peace. You know, whether you are the wealthy or whether you are the poorest or the poorest of the poor, your life becomes one which is actually very stripped of quality, of dignity, of those things that we would understand as the wholesomeness of life. And so when we talk about changing society, that COVID is calling us to look at things again, it's not just to the benefit of the middle class or the poor. We're saying life for everybody needs to be transformed to be a decent and a dignified human life. And it's these kinds of connections that we need to try and make. But sometimes we talk about it because COVID has actually raised that red flag. But at certain points, it seems like some want to go back to the old normal, so to speak.
Yes. To our comforts. Yeah. Okay, Frank.
So I think that. So I like the fact that you always talk about education, because the education example shows us exactly the kind of country we are, except, quite distinct from what the rosy picture we have in our imagination. And the education thing brings us back to the kind of work we need to do to create an inclusive society, which actually accepts the humanity of every person, the humanness of all of us. And that interconnectedness should be the key to how we resolve, whether it's your political issue, political inclusive and political democracy, whether it's the economic crisis or whether it's the environmental crisis. It's that interconnectedness that we must come back to.
Yeah. Thank you, Frank.
Great.
Thanks as always, hey? Lovely to chat.
Yeah. Have a lovely weekend.
You too, Frank.